I stood in the rain, staring at the house that was never mine, clutching a will that didn't even mention my name. 10 years of devotion, and I was nothing to them. How could she leave me with nothing after all I'd done? I stayed quiet, but not because I had no choice. I was waiting. Welcome to the Betrayal Revenge channel, where stories come alive through voices you've never heard told this way before. Join us in uncovering truths hidden in the shadows, and let's walk this path together. It all began 3 months ago, on a rainy afternoon I'll never forget. The rain tapped against the window like a restless finger, each drop blurring the world outside. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of lavender tea and the faint, sterile tang of antiseptic. I sat by Eleanor's bedside, my hands folded in my lap, watching the rise and fall of her chest. It was slow, deliberate, as if each breath was a choice. Her eyes, once sharp and knowing, were clouded now, but they still held me when they met mine. There was something in that look, something I couldn't name. "Olivia," she whispered, her voice brittle as dry leaves. "Ju lai thu thuak ve kon. Keep what belongs to you." I leaned closer, my heart tightening. "What do you mean, Eleanor?" But she only closed her eyes, her lips trembling as if the effort to speak had drained her. I wanted to press her, to ask what she meant, but I didn't. I never did. For 10 years I'd cared for her, bathed her, fed her, read to her through endless nights when sleep wouldn't come. I'd given everything to this house, to this family, after my husband's death left me with nothing but a 7-year-old son and a promise to keep going. And yet, sitting there, I felt like an intruder. Had I missed something? Had I misunderstood her all these years? The room was dim, the only light coming from a small lamp on the nightstand. It cast long shadows across the walls, stretching my silhouette until it looked like a stranger's. I reached for the teacup, its warmth seeping into my palms, and tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Eleanor had always been kind to me, more than kind. She'd welcomed me as a daughter when I married her son, even after he was gone. But that phrase, it lingered, sharp and unfinished, like a key to a door I didn't know existed. The next morning she was gone. I found her just after dawn, her hand cold in mine, her face serene. The house felt emptier than it ever had, the silence louder than the rain had been. I called the doctor, then Denise, her eldest daughter. My voice shook as I spoke, but Denise's was flat, clipped. "We'll handle the arrangements," she said. "Just stay out of the way." Stay out of the way. The words stung, but I swallowed them. I always did. The funeral was a blur of gray suits and murmured condolences. Bell Harbor's small church was packed, but not with grief. People came because they had to, because Eleanor had been a fixture in this town, her quiet generosity known to everyone but her own children. Denise stood at the front, her chin high, her black dress pristine. Owen, her younger brother, lingered near the back with his wife Lily, who kept checking her phone. I sat in the third row with Max, my son, his small hand gripping mine. He didn't cry. He barely knew his grandmother, but he felt my tension, his eyes searching my face for answers I didn't have. After the service, Denise cornered me in the church hall. The air smelled of stale coffee and wilting flowers. "Olivia, you'll need to clear out the house," she said, her voice sharp, like she was giving orders to a maid. "We're selling it. No need to drag this out." I froze, my fingers tightening around the paper cup in my hand. "The house?" I managed, but I thought I could stay, at least for a while. She raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Stay? For what? You've done your part. It's time to move on." Her words hit like a slap, but I didn't flinch, not outwardly. Inside, my chest burned with a mix of shame and anger. Done my part? 10 years of my life poured into caring for their mother, and that was all it was to her. A job I'd finished. I wanted to scream, to tell her how I'd held Eleanor's hand through every fever, every sleepless night, how I'd memorized her favorite poems, learned to cook her childhood recipes just to see her smile. But I didn't. I stood there, silent, my throat tight, as Denise walked away. Why hadn't Eleanor told them? Why hadn't she said anything about me? That night, I sat in the kitchen of the old seaside house, the one I'd called home for a decade. The walls were weathered, the paint peeling in places, but it was ours, mine and Max's, or so I'd thought. The will had been read that afternoon, in a lawyer's office that smelled of leather and dust. Denise and Owen were there, their faces unreadable. The lawyer's voice was monotone as he listed Eleanor's assets, the family estate, the savings, the summer cottage. All of it went to her children. My name wasn't mentioned, not once. I'd sat there, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles turned white, waiting for something, anything that would acknowledge the years I'd given. But there was nothing, just a clause allowing me to remain in the secondary residence until further notice. The secondary residence, this creaking, drafty house by the cliffs, the one Eleanor had loved but her children despised. Max was upstairs asleep, his soft snores carrying through the thin walls. I stared at the table, at the faint ring left by Eleanor's teacup, and felt the weight of it all. 10 years ago, I'd been a widow at 25, grieving a husband who died too young. I'd stayed for Eleanor, for Max, for the promise of family. I'd thought I was part of this one. I'd thought I mattered. But Denise's voice echoed in my head. Move on. And Owen's silence, his refusal to meet my eyes. Even Lily, with her sharp glances and whispered asides to Owen, had made it clear I was nothing to them. A shadow, a ghost who'd lingered too long. I traced my finger along the table's edge, the wood smooth from years of use. Eleanor's words came back to me. Keep what belongs to you. Had she meant the house, her love, or something else entirely? I didn't know, but the question gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. Why had she left me nothing when I'd been the one by her side? Why had she let them treat me like that? Accordance with the trust founder's wishes and contractual terms, you hold no authority over this fund. Do not submit further invalid requests. I could almost picture the look on Chad's face as he read it. He had calculated everything, except for the fact that I was no longer the woman he could manipulate. The next day, Lauren showed up at my door. The moment she walked in, she got right to the point. You have expected all these, didn't you? I didn't respond. I simply set a glass of water on the table. She clenched her jaw. You're ruthless. This isn't ruthlessness, I said calmly. It's protection. She stared at me, but her voice lacked its usual force. You think you've won. Chad isn't the kind of man who gives up easily. He can fight all he wants, I said quietly, but he'll never get a cent. What you're trying to take was never yours to begin with. Lauren stood abruptly, her tone turning sharp. Don't get too full of yourself. I gave a faint smile. I'm not. You were the ones who thought this would be easy. She slammed the door behind her, leaving a trace of bitterness and frustration in the air. A few days later, I saw Chad outside the grocery store. He looked like he'd aged 10 years, his face drawn, his eyes clouded with fatigue and defeat. The man who once walked out of our home with his chest puffed, confidence oozing from every word, now looked like a worn-out shadow of himself. He spotted me and took a tentative step forward, then stopped, unsure. I stood still, watching him calmly. You won, Kylie, he said quietly, his voice rough, his throat tightening around the words. No, I replied evenly. You were just too greedy. This was never a competition. You've simply never understood that some things can't be taken by force or manipulation. His gaze dropped to the ground. It took him a moment to speak again. I thought maybe I could still hold on to something. You once had a whole family, I said softly. You were the one who walked away. If you have nothing now, it's because you chose that. Chad didn't argue. He didn't beg. He didn't plead. The fight had drained out of him. He stayed in town a few more days, then quietly packed his things and left. No grand goodbye, no drama, just disappeared, the same way he had all those years ago. Lauren never showed up again. The two who had once tried so hard to unravel my life were finally gone for good. A few days later, I started getting involved in community activities. For so many years, I had handled everything on my own, quiet, invisible, keeping my head down. But now, I was stepping out, not to please anyone, but because I had finally realized I had every right to choose the life I wanted. The local library was looking for volunteers. I signed up. The neighborhood association needed help with event planning. I showed up to arrange tables and hang decorations. The Children's Art Center asked for parent helpers. I became one of the regulars. "You're always so thoughtful," Susan, one of the organizers, said warmly. "With you around, everything just runs smoother." I smiled lightly. Maybe I'm just used to taking care of people. But what Susan didn't see was that this time, my smile felt lighter than it had in years. Ethan, too, had started to adjust to this new chapter. His emotions had settled. He seemed more at ease, more open. Every afternoon after school, he'd come home bubbling with stories. Who said what in class, what game they played at recess. Last week, he brought home a certificate for excellence on a math quiz. I hung it proudly on the refrigerator door and found myself glancing at it every time I passed by. In the evenings, he would sit quietly at the desk doing homework while I worked beside him, going over notes for a project I'd been thinking about for months. I wanted to open a small, home-based consulting service, something that used the caregiving skills I'd spent years building. A place where women like me, overwhelmed and forgotten, could come for guidance, support, and maybe just a listening ear. It wasn't just about making money. It was about offering something I had once so desperately needed. I reached out to an old friend who now worked in family services. She was leading a community program focused on rebuilding broken family relationships. "You really want to do this?" she asked, a bit surprised. "I want to try," I said with a nod. There was a time when I wished someone would reach out and pull me out of the dark. Now I wanted to be that hand for someone else. She reached over and squeezed my hand gently. "You've changed, Kylie. You've grown into someone stronger, someone better." I didn't say anything. I just smiled. Time moved quietly forward, like nothing had happened, and yet as if everything had changed. The trees along the street had begun to sprout tender new leaves. Sunlight spilled across the windowsill, and the air carried the soft scent of early summer. In the kitchen, I brewed a cup of black tea. The house was still, filled only with the gentle sound of the kettle simmering. Ethan sat at his desk, writing. The sunlight touched his shoulders, casting a golden hue across his notebook. He scribbled with focused concentration, occasionally tilting his head to think before continuing on. He had grown taller, his features slowly shedding their childhood softness, growing sharper, calmer, more defined. This was my life now, simple, quiet, free of unnecessary people, and free of unnecessary emotions. That afternoon, Ethan and I took a walk through the community garden. He held my hand tightly, chattering all the way about the new art class at school, telling me how he had drawn a huge tree with a little bird's nest made from cut paper. "Mom, did you like drawing when you were little?" "I did," I said with a smile, "but I wasn't very good at it." "I bet your drawings were way better than mine," he said earnestly. I knelt down and hugged him. "But your tree is the best I've ever seen." He laughed, light and bright, then tugged me along as we kept walking. Sunlight filtered through the branches, scattering across the path in soft, flickering patterns. My steps were steady, unhurried, just like life itself now. No longer rushed. no longer lost. That evening we cooked dinner together in the kitchen. He washed the vegetables while I stood at the stove. On the table sat his drawing of the big tree, which I'd pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet. "When you grow up, this drawing will still be here." "Really?" "Really. It'll remind me there was once a little boy in this kitchen, washing vegetables, laughing, telling stories." His eyes sparkled, and then he said, "Mom, when I grow up, I'll protect you, just like you protect me now." My heart caught for a moment. My hands paused over the skillet. Then I smiled and nodded. "Deal. We have a promise." Late at night, the house fell into a gentle hush. I sat alone on the balcony, the tea in my hand long gone cold. The streetlights glowed softly in the distance, and now and then a night bird called out in the dark. I closed my eyes and thought of every step I had taken to get here, the pain, the struggle, the lonely days I had carried all by myself. Now softened like ripples on the surface of water, slowly smoothed by time. I no longer needed anyone's validation. I no longer needed anyone's apology. I had learned how to tuck the pain away in the quiet corners of my memory and still move forward, still live my life. From inside, I could hear Ethan's gentle breathing. It was the most comforting sound in my world. And in a quiet whisper meant only for myself, I said, "I'm home, truly home in my own life." The night breeze lifted the curtains. I rose slowly and closed the window. Behind me was a house that finally, fully belonged to me. I stood and walked to the window, the glass cool against my fingertips. The ocean was out there, just beyond the cliffs, its waves a low, restless murmur. I'd always loved this house, its quirks, its history, but now it felt like a cage. I pressed my forehead against the glass, my breath fogging the pain. I'd thought I was her daughter. I'd thought I was family. But to them I'd never existed. The salt air clung to everything in Bell Harbor, seeping into the walls of the old house until the wood smelled faintly of the sea. I stood at the sink, scrubbing a pot that didn't need scrubbing, the cold water numbing my fingers. The kitchen was quiet except for the drip of the faucet, each drop hitting the basin like a metronome. Outside, the cliffs loomed, gray and unyielding, their edges softened by the morning fog. This house, with its peeling paint and creaking floors, was all I had left. A temporary shelter, the lawyer had called it. Temporary. The word tasted bitter, like the coffee I'd let go cold on the counter. Max's laughter broke the silence, drifting in from the living room. He was sprawled on the rug, piecing together a puzzle of a lighthouse, his small fingers deft and sure. I dried my hands and leaned against the doorway, watching him. At 9, he was all curiosity and light, his dark curls falling into his eyes. He didn't know about the will, didn't know how close we were to losing this place. But he felt the weight of it, in his own way. "Mom," he said, not looking up, "why don't we have a big house like Uncle Owen's?" The question caught me off guard, a needle slipping under my skin. I forced a smile, kneeling beside him. "This house is special, Max. It's got stories in every corner." He tilted his head, unconvinced. "But Uncle Owen's house has a pool, and Aunt Denise's has those big windows." I brushed a curl from his forehead, my chest tightening. "Big windows don't make a home, sweetheart. This place, it's ours, for now." For now. I hated how those words slipped out, how they betrayed the uncertainty I was trying to hide. Max went back to his puzzle, but his question lingered, echoing the whispers I'd heard in town. The neighbors meant well, most of them. Mrs. Callahan, who ran the bakery, had slipped me an extra loaf of bread yesterday, her eyes soft with pity. "You've done so much for Eleanor," she'd said. "It's not right you being left like this." Others weren't so kind. At the market, I'd caught Mrs. Porter's hushed tone as she leaned toward a friend. "Living in that old shack like she's squatting. What's she even staying for?" I stood, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the counter. The shame burned, but it wasn't just their words. It was the truth they carried. I was squatting, in a way. The house wasn't mine, not really. And every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the cracked windows reminded me of that. The doorbell rang, sharp and jarring. I smoothed my apron and opened the door to find Denise standing there, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. The air around her felt heavy, like a storm about to break. She didn't wait for an invitation, brushing past me into the kitchen. Her perfume, something sharp and expensive, clashed with the salt and damp of the house. "Olivia," she said, her voice clipped, "you need to think about selling this place." I blinked, caught off guard. Selling? But I'm still living here. Max and I... She waved a hand, cutting me off. "It's not practical. This house is falling apart. Owen's already got a buyer lined up for the estate next door. You could get a decent price, move somewhere, smaller, more suitable." Her words were smooth, almost kind, but they carried a weight I recognized. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, wrapped in the pretense of concern. I stared at her, at the way her eyes flicked over the room, cataloging its flaws, the chipped paint, the warped cabinets. To her, this house was a burden, a leftover she wanted cleared away. "I'm not ready to sell," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. Denise raised an eyebrow, her smile tight. "Don't be sentimental, Olivia. You can't afford to keep this place, not on your own." The implication stung. "You're nothing without us." I wanted to snap back, to tell her I'd managed just fine for 10 years without her help, but I didn't. I stood there, my hands clasped, feeling the familiar weight of being less than. She left soon after, her heels clicking against the floorboards, but her words stayed, sinking into the walls like the salt air. I closed the door and leaned against it, my breath shallow. Why did I let her talk to me like that? Why did I always let them? That afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard a car pull up. Through the window, I saw a man in a suit, clipboard in hand, walking toward the house. He knocked, and I opened the door, my stomach twisting. "Mrs. Harper," he said, glancing at his notes, "I'm here to inspect the property. Mr. Owen sent me." I froze. Owen. Of course. Denise's visit hadn't been random. They were moving fast, circling like vultures. "There must be a mistake," I said, keeping my voice steady. "This house isn't for sale." He frowned, checking his clipboard again. "I was told to assess the value for a potential buyer." "No," I said, sharper than I intended. "You're not coming in." He hesitated, then nodded and left, but the encounter left me shaken. They weren't just suggesting I leave. They were planning it. I sank onto the couch, my hands pressed to my temples. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Had Eleanor known this would happen? Had she seen how her children would turn on me? Max's voice pulled me back. "Mom, look what I found!" He was holding an old dollhouse, one he hadn't touched in years. It was a miniature of this house, complete with tiny shutters and a sloping roof, a gift from his father before he died. Max had dragged it out from the attic, its wood dusty but intact. "Remember when Dad used to play with this?" he said, his eyes bright. "He'd make up stories about the people inside." I smiled, but it felt brittle. "Yeah, I remember." Max set the dollhouse on the coffee table, his fingers tracing the tiny windows. "Do you miss him?" The question was so soft, so innocent, it nearly broke me. I swallowed, kneeling beside him. "Sometimes," I said, "but we've got each other, don't we?" He nodded, but his eyes lingered on the dollhouse as if it held answers I couldn't give. I reached out, brushing dust from its roof. The wood was smooth under my fingers, the craftsmanship meticulous. Eleanor had loved this dollhouse too. She'd called it a little world for Max. I hadn't looked at it closely in years, but now something about it drew me in. Maybe it was Max's question, or the ache of his father's memory, or the weight of Denise's visit. Whatever it was, I felt a pull, like the house itself was whispering. That night, after Max was asleep, I sat by the dollhouse with a damp cloth, wiping away years of neglect. The act was soothing, almost meditative, each stroke uncovering details I'd forgotten. The tiny brass hinges, the painted flowers on the porch. I didn't know why I was doing it, but something urged me on, as if this small, forgotten thing held a secret I was meant to find. What was I looking for? And why did I feel like the answer was closer than I thought? The air in the living room was thick with the scent of dust and salt, the kind that settles into old houses by the sea. The dollhouse sat on the coffee table, its miniature shingles glowing faintly under the lamplight. I'd been cleaning it for hours, my hands moving on instinct, wiping away years of neglect. Max was asleep upstairs, his soft snores a steady rhythm through the thin walls. The house was quiet, but my mind was loud, replaying Denise's orders, Owen's inspector, the neighbor's whispers. I was tired, bone deep of being pushed aside. Why had I started cleaning this dollhouse? I didn't know. Maybe it was Max's question about his father, or the way the tiny house reminded me of Eleanor's smile when she'd given it to him. Or maybe it was her voice, that strange, cryptic phrase she'd whispered before she died, "Keep what belongs to you." It echoed in my head, sharp and insistent, like a puzzle I was meant to solve. I ran the cloth over the dollhouse's tiny porch, my fingers brushing against a loose panel in the base. It wiggled under my touch, not like the rest of the sturdy frame. I paused, my breath catching. The panel was small, barely noticeable, tucked beneath the miniature staircase. I pressed it gently, and it popped open with a soft click, revealing a hollow compartment. My heart thudded as I reached inside, my fingers brushing against something smooth and cool, a small metal box, no bigger than a pack of cards. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. The box was old, its edges rusted, but it opened easily, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, and a single sheet of thicker parchment, neatly creased. I unfolded the paper first, my eyes scanning the handwriting. It was Eleanor's, shaky but unmistakable, the same script I'd seen on her grocery lists and birthday cards. "Dear Olivia," it began. I stopped, my throat tightening. The room seemed to shrink, the walls leaning in as I read on. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found what I couldn't give you openly. I'm sorry, my dear, for the silence. I wanted to protect you, but I was afraid of what they'd do if they knew. You've been my daughter, more than they ever were my children. You gave me 10 years of love, and I've watched you carry this family when no one else would. The deed in this box is yours. It's the house by the cliffs, the one you've made a home. I signed it over to you 2 years ago in secret, because I knew they'd fight you. They'll try to take it, Olivia, but don't let them. Keep what belongs to you. You've earned it, and more. With all my love, Eleanor." Tears blurred my vision, hot and heavy, spilling onto the paper. I pressed a hand to my mouth, stifling a sob. Eleanor hadn't forgotten me. She'd seen me, every sacrifice, every quiet moment I'd thought went unnoticed. She'd known her children would turn on me, and she'd planned for it, hiding this gift where they'd never look. I unfolded the parchment next. It was a deed, official and stamped, transferring ownership of the seaside house to me, Olivia Harper, dated 2 years prior. My name stared back at me, bold and undeniable. This house, the one Denise wanted to sell, the one Owen's inspector had eyed, was mine, legally, irrevocably mine. I sat back, the box still in my lap, and let the weight of it sink in. The room felt different now, the shadows softer, the air lighter. I traced the edges of the letter, my fingers lingering on Eleanor's signature. She'd written about a fight, years ago when she'd tried to change her will. Denise had been furious, threatening to sue, claiming Eleanor wasn't of sound mind. Owen had stayed silent, as always, but Lily had whispered poison in his ear, warning of legal battles that could drain the estate. Eleanor had backed down, but not because she was weak. She'd found another way, a secret way, to protect me. I remembered that day, vaguely. Eleanor had been upset, her hands trembling as she sipped her tea. I'd asked what was wrong, but she'd only smiled and said, "Family can be complicated, Olivia, but you're my family too." I hadn't understood then. I did now. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, marking the hours I spent rereading the letter. Each word was a balm, soothing the wounds Denise's cruelty had left. But it was more than that. It was a spark, igniting something I'd buried long ago, hope. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't a shadow. Eleanor had seen me, and she'd given me a weapon to fight back. But could I use it? The deed was legal, but Denise and Owen wouldn't let it go easily. They'd fight, just as Eleanor had warned. They'd question the deed's validity, drag me through courts, paint me as a schemer. I could hear Denise's voice now, sharp and accusing. How convenient, Olivia, finding this after she's gone. And Lily, with her sly smiles, would twist every truth until it looked like a lie. I stood pacing the room, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The ocean roared faintly outside, its rhythm steadying my thoughts. I needed to be sure. I needed to know this deed was airtight, that Eleanor's gift couldn't be taken from me. I glanced at the dollhouse, its tiny windows glinting in the lamplight. It had kept this secret for years, waiting for me to find it. Now it was my turn to act. I tucked the letter and deed back into the box, hiding it beneath a stack of books on the shelf. Max couldn't know. Not yet. He was too young, too trusting, and I wouldn't let this battle touch him. But as I climbed the stairs to check on him, my steps felt lighter, my spine straighter. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just surviving. I was planning. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The house was still mine, but it was more than wood and stone. It was a promise Eleanor had made, and one I'd keep. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun break through the fog, its light spilling across the cliffs. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. I pulled on my coat, my movements deliberate, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the scent of salt and pine sharp in my lungs. I wasn't leaving to escape. I was leaving to fight, a fight I wouldn't lose. What could I do with this secret? And how far would I go to protect what was mine? The morning air in Bell Harbor was sharp, carrying the bite of salt and pine as I stepped onto the porch. The cliffs loomed in the distance, their edges softened by a thin veil of fog. I pulled my coat tighter, the weight of the metal box in my bag pressing against my hip. Inside it, Eleanor's letter and the deed lay carefully folded, their edges worn, but their promise intact. The house behind me creaked as the wind tugged at its shutters, as if urging me forward. I glanced back, my eyes lingering on the weathered door. This was my home, mine and Max's, and I wouldn't let them take it. I walked into town, my boots clicking against the uneven cobblestones. Bell Harbor was waking up slowly, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, the bakery's warm scent of bread drifting through the air. I kept my head down, avoiding the curious glances of neighbors. They'd been talking since the funeral, their whispers a mix of pity and suspicion. Poor Olivia, left with nothing, or maybe she's hiding something. I tightened my grip on the bag, my resolve hardening. Let them talk. I wasn't here to prove myself to them. Not yet. The lawyer's office was a small, unassuming building tucked between a bookstore and a cafe. Its sign read, Harrington and Associates. The letters faded but precise. I'd found Mr. Harrington through Mrs. Callahan at the bakery. She'd sworn he was trustworthy, the kind of man who'd handled Eleanor's affairs with care. I pushed open the door, a bell jingling softly above me. The air inside was warm, smelling of polished wood and old paper. A receptionist glanced up, her smile polite but distant. "Olivia Harper," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I have an appointment." She nodded, gesturing to a chair. I sat, my hands clasped over the bag, my thumb tracing the strap's worn leather. The waiting room was quiet. Rotating image of a clock was faint, its hands barely moving. My eyes drifted to a framed map on the wall, Bell Harbor's coastline sketched in delicate ink. I stared at it, my mind replaying the moment I'd found the deed. Eleanor's handwriting, her words, "Keep what belongs to you." I closed my eyes, the memory of her voice soft but firm. She'd trusted me. Now, I had to trust myself. "Mrs. Harper?" A man's voice pulled me back. I stood, smoothing my coat. Mr. Harrington was older, his hair silver, but his eyes sharp, like he could see through to my bones. He led me to a small office, its walls lined with bookshelves, a single window letting in pale sunlight. I sat across from him, placing the metal box on the desk. "I need your help," I said, my voice low. "I found something. From my mother-in-law, Eleanor." He raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. I opened the box, sliding the letter and deed across the desk. His fingers, steady and precise, unfolded the documents. The room was quiet, save for the faint tick of a clock and the rustle of paper. I watched his face, searching for any sign, doubt, surprise, reassurance. His expression gave nothing away. "This is Eleanor's handwriting," he said finally, his voice measured. "I'd recognize it anywhere. She was a client for years." My shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. "So it's real?" He nodded, his eyes meeting mine. "The deed is legitimate. It's dated, notarized, and filed with the county 2 years ago. It transfers ownership of the seaside property to you, Olivia Harper, in full." I exhaled, the air leaving me in a rush. It was real. Eleanor's gift was mine, but the relief was short-lived, chased by a new fear. What about her children? Denise and Owen. They think the house belongs to them. They're already trying to sell it. Harrington leaned back, his fingers steepled. "They'll likely challenge it, claim coercion or question Eleanor's mental state. It's common in cases like this, especially with family." My stomach twisted. I'd expected this, but hearing it aloud made it heavier. "Can they win?" "Not easily," he said, his tone firm. "The deed is clear, and Eleanor's intent is documented here." He tapped the letter. "In her own words. We can verify her mental capacity at the time of signing. She was sharp, Olivia. I spoke with her myself when she filed this. She knew exactly what she was doing." I nodded, my mind racing. Eleanor had been careful, deliberate. She'd known her children would fight, just as she'd written. I pictured her, frail but resolute, signing the deed in secret, hiding it in the dollhouse where only I would find it. The weight of her trust settled over me, both a comfort and a burden. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Harrington's eyes softened, just slightly. "We start the process to formalize the transfer. I'll file a quiet claim to ensure the title is clear in your name. We'll also prepare for any challenges, gather witnesses, medical records, anything to prove Eleanor's soundness of mind." I swallowed, the words sinking in. This was real, a path forward. "And if they try to fight it?" "Then we fight back," he said, a glint in his eye. "You have a strong case, Olivia, but for now keep this quiet. Don't tell anyone. Not your son, not the neighbors. The less they know, the better." I nodded, my resolve hardening. Silence was my weapon, just as it had been Eleanor's. I wouldn't give Denise or Owen a chance to strike first. Harrington handed me a pen and a stack of papers, forms to initiate the transfer, affidavits to sign. I read each one carefully, my hand steady as I wrote my name. The sunlight streamed through the window, catching the ink as it dried, a faint shimmer on the page. Each signature felt like a step, a reclaiming of what was mine. I wasn't just signing papers. I was drawing a line, one they wouldn't cross. When we finished, Harrington stood, extending his hand. "You're doing the right thing, Olivia. Eleanor would be proud." I shook his hand, my grip firm. "Thank you," I said, meaning it. I left the office with the metal box back in my bag, its weight lighter now, like a promise kept. The town felt different as I walked home, brighter, sharper, as if the fog had lifted. The bakery's windows glowed, the cobblestones gleamed under the sun. I passed Mrs. Callahan, who waved, her smile warm but curious. I waved back, my face neutral, giving nothing away. Back at the house, I slipped the box into a drawer, burying it beneath a stack of Max's old drawings. He was at school, the house quiet except for the distant crash of waves. I stood at the kitchen window, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea, the steam curling against my face. The cliffs stretched before me, rugged and unyielding, like the strength I felt growing inside. I was ready to watch them now, Denise with her orders, Owen with his schemes, Lily with her sly glances. They thought I was weak, a widow clinging to a crumbling house. They had no idea what I held or what I was capable of. What would they do when they learned the truth? And how carefully would I need to tread to keep it safe? The sun hung low over Bell Harbor, casting long shadows across the cliffs as I stood on the porch, my hands wrapped around a chipped mug. The air was heavy with salt and the faint tang of seaweed, the ocean's restless murmur a constant companion. Inside, the house was still, Max's crayons scattered across the kitchen table where he'd been drawing before school. The deed was safe, locked in its drawer, but its weight pressed against me, a secret I carried in every breath. I'd met with Mr. Harrington, set the wheels in motion, but the fight hadn't begun. Not yet. I scanned the street, my eyes lingering on the empty road. They were out there, Denise, Owen, Lily, moving like sharks, their intentions hidden but their presence unmistakable. I'd felt it for days, the way Denise's visits had grown more frequent, her tone too casual, the way Owen's truck lingered near the house, idling just long enough to unsettle me. Lily was the worst, her sharp eyes darting over every detail when she dropped by with coffee or excuses. They thought I was oblivious, a grieving widow too broken to notice their game. They were wrong. The crunch of gravel snapped me back. Denise's car pulled up sleek and out of place against the weathered fence. She stepped out, her heels sinking slightly into the dirt, her smile as polished as her nails. "Olivia," she called, waving like we were old friends. "Thought I'd check in. You doing okay out here?" I set the mug down, my face neutral. "Fine," I said, stepping forward. "What brings you by?" She shrugged, her eyes flicking to the house. "Just wanted to see how you're holding up. This place, it's a lot to maintain, isn't it? All alone." Her words were soft, but they carried a barb. I tilted my head, letting a faint smile play on my lips. "I manage." She hesitated, then stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Owen's been talking to some developers. They're interested in this stretch of land. Could be a good opportunity for you to cash out, start fresh." My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression steady. Developers. Owen's inspector hadn't been a one-off. They were escalating, pressing harder to push me out. "I'm not looking to sell," I said, my tone even. "This is home." Denise's smile tightened, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Don't be stubborn, Olivia. You can't stay here forever. It's not practical." I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch. Practical. The word was a weapon, meant to make me feel small, incapable. But I wasn't the same woman who'd stood silent at the funeral. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice deliberately soft, as if I were considering it. She nodded, satisfied, and left without another word. I watched her car disappear, my hands clenched at my sides. She thought she'd planted a seed, but all she'd done was confirm what I already knew. They wanted the house, and they'd do anything to get it. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, a notebook open in front of me. I'd started keeping track of their visits, dates, times, what they said. Every interaction was a piece of the puzzle, a thread I could pull if it came to a fight. I wrote down Denise's words, her mention of developers, the way her eyes had lingered on the house's foundation. It wasn't just about selling. They were testing me, probing for weaknesses. The back door creaked and I tensed, my pen freezing mid-sentence. Max's voice followed, bright and carefree. "Mom, I'm home." I exhaled, closing the notebook. "In here, sweetheart." He bounded in, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his cheeks flushed from the walk. "Mrs. Callahan gave me a cookie," he said, grinning. "Said it was for being a good helper." I smiled, ruffling his hair. "You're always helping someone, aren't you?" He nodded, then paused, his eyes drifting to the window. "Mom, there was a guy outside earlier. He was looking at the house, said he was checking the pipes or something." My stomach dropped. What did he look like? Max shrugged. "Kinda tall, had a hat. He asked if you were home, but I said you were busy." I forced a smile, my mind racing. Pipes. Another inspector or something worse. "You did good, Max. If you see him again, come get me, okay?" He nodded, oblivious to the weight of his words, and ran upstairs. I stood, moving to the window, my eyes scanning the darkening street. The cliffs loomed in the distance, their shadows blending with the dusk. Whoever this man was, he wasn't checking pipes. I'd seen Owen's friend Tom at the hardware store last week, his baseball cap pulled low, his eyes avoiding mine. It could have been him. I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my phone and ordered a small security camera online, one I could hide near the porch. It would arrive tomorrow and I'd install it myself. No one was stepping foot on this property without me knowing. I sat back down, my hands steady as I reopened the notebook. I added the stranger's visit, Max's description, my suspicions about Tom. Each word felt like a brick in the wall I was building, a defense against whatever they were planning. The next morning, Lily showed up, her knock sharp and insistent. I opened the door, my face a mask of polite surprise. She held a thermos, her smile too bright. "Brought you some coffee," she said, stepping inside without asking. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up." "Thanks," I said, taking the thermos but not drinking. I gestured to the couch, keeping my movements slow, deliberate. "What's on your mind?" She sat, crossing her legs, her eyes roaming the room. "Just checking in. Owen's been so busy with the estate sale, you know. This whole stretch of land is prime real estate. You could make a fortune if you sold." Her words mirrored Denise's, but her tone was different, sly, probing. I leaned back, my hands folded in my lap. "I'm not sure I'm ready to let go," I said, my voice soft, almost wistful. "This house means a lot to Max." Lily's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Sure, but think about his future. A sale could set you both up. New school, new opportunities." I nodded as if considering it, but my eyes never left hers. She was fishing, trying to gauge what I knew. I let her talk, her words spilling out, market values, developers, the potential of the cliffs. I memorized every detail, every hint of their plan. When she left, I added her visit to the notebook, underlining her mention of the estate sale. They weren't just after my house. They wanted the whole coastline, and I was in their way. That night, I stood in the kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear. Mr. Harrington's voice was calm, reassuring. "The title transfer is moving forward," he said, "but keep documenting everything. If they try anything, we'll need evidence." "I will," I said, my voice firm. I hung up, my eyes drifting to the drawer where the deed was hidden. They thought I was clueless, a pawn in their game, but I was watching, waiting, ready to turn their moves against them. Then, as I locked the back door, I heard it, a low murmur from the porch. I froze, my heart pounding, and crept to the window. Through the gap in the curtains, I saw Denise's silhouette, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, but the words carried, "We need to get her out before the developers move in. She's stubborn, but she'll break." I stepped back, my breath shallow, and grabbed my phone, hitting record. The audio was faint, but it was enough. Denise's voice, her plan captured in my hands. I saved the file, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. They thought I knew nothing. They were about to learn how wrong they were. What were they planning next? And how much further would they go to take what wasn't theirs? The kitchen smelled of lemons and wax, the countertops gleaming from a morning of scrubbing. I'd been cleaning to keep my hands busy, to quiet the storm in my mind. The security camera was up, its tiny lens hidden in a potted plant by the porch, recording every visitor. The notebook lay open on the table, filled with my meticulous notes, Denise's visits, Lily's probing, the stranger Max had seen. And in my pocket, my phone held the audio of Denise's late-night call, her voice plotting to force me out. Each piece was a weapon, and I was learning how to wield them. The cliffs outside were bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, the ocean's rhythm steady but distant. Max was at a friend's house, his laughter safe for now. I stood at the sink, rinsing a glass, when the doorbell rang, sharp, impatient. My pulse quickened, but I dried my hands slowly, deliberately, and slipped my phone into record mode before tucking it into my apron pocket. I knew who it was before I opened the door. Denise stood there, her arms crossed, her face a mask of forced concern. "Olivia," she said, her voice syrupy. "We need to talk." I stepped aside, gesturing her in. "Come in. Coffee?" She shook her head, her eyes scanning the kitchen as she sat at the table. Her purse landed with a thud, the sound heavy in the quiet room. I sat across from her, my hands folded, my face calm but my senses sharp. The phone in my pocket was recording, capturing every word, every breath. "I'm worried about you," Denise began, leaning forward. "This house, it's too much for you, and Max, he deserves better than this relic. Owen's got a buyer ready to take it off your hands. You could move somewhere new, start over." Her words were rehearsed, each one laced with pity designed to cut. I tilted my head, letting a faint smile play on my lips. "That's generous of you, Denise, but I like it here. So does Max." Her smile faltered, a crack in her composure. "Don't be naive, Olivia. You can't afford this place. Taxes, repairs. It's a money pit. And honestly," she paused, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "people are talking. They think you're unstable, clinging to a house that's not even yours." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. My heart pounded, but I kept my expression soft, almost amused. "Unstable?" I echoed, my voice light. "That's a strong word. Who's saying that, Denise? You?" Her eyes narrowed, but she recovered quickly, leaning back with a sigh. "I'm just trying to help. You've been through a lot, losing your husband, caring for Mom all those years. It's taken a toll. No one would blame you for struggling." I leaned forward, my hands still folded, my gaze locked on hers. "I'm not struggling," I said, my voice steady, each word deliberate. "And this house, it's more mine than you think." The air shifted, heavy with tension. Denise's fingers twitched, her nails tapping the table. "What's that supposed to mean?" I smiled, just enough to unsettle her. "Eleanor was careful, Denise. She didn't leave things to chance. You might be surprised what she planned." Her face tightened, a flicker of doubt crossing her eyes. "You're delusional," she snapped, her voice rising. "Mom left everything to us, her children. You were just help. If you think you can make up stories to steal what's ours, you're more unstable than I thought." The word steal hit like a spark, igniting something inside me. I stood, my movements slow, controlled, and walked to the counter, turning my back to her just long enough to let her think she'd won. But my hand brushed the phone in my pocket, ensuring it was still recording. I turned, leaning against the counter, my arms crossed. "Careful, Denise?" I said, my voice low, almost gentle. "You're awfully quick to call me a thief, but I've been here day after day for 10 years. Where were you when Eleanor needed you? When she couldn't lift a spoon? When she cried at night because her own children never called?" Her mouth opened, then closed, her cheeks flushing. "You have no right." "I have every right," I cut in, my voice sharp now, slicing through her protest. "I was her family when you weren't, and she knew it. She saw everything, your greed, your absence. You think you can just waltz in and take what's left? You're not as clever as you think." Denise stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're making a mistake, Olivia," she hissed, her voice trembling with anger. "You keep this up, and you'll regret it. We'll make sure of it." The threat hung between us, raw and unguarded. I held her gaze, unflinching, letting her see the steel in my eyes. "Try me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She grabbed her purse, her movements jerky, and stormed out, the door slamming behind her. I stood still, my breath shallow, the adrenaline coursing through me. The kitchen felt smaller, the walls echoing her words. "You'll regret it." But I wasn't afraid, not anymore. I pulled the phone from my pocket, stopping the recording. Her voice was there, clear and damning, her accusations, her threat, her slip about making sure I'd lose. I saved the file, my hands steady, and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Each word she'd spoken was a nail in her own coffin, and I'd drive them in when the time was right. The back door creaked, and I turned, my heart skipping. Max stood there, his backpack slung over his shoulder, his eyes wide. "Mom," he said softly, "I heard you. You sounded strong." I crossed the room, kneeling in front of him, my hands on his shoulders. His face was open, a mix of awe and pride, and it hit me. He'd never seen me like this. Not the quiet, grieving mother who'd carried the weight of this family alone, but a woman who fought back. I smiled, brushing a curl from his forehead. "I'm just protecting us, sweetheart," I said. "Like always." He nodded, his small hand squeezing mine, and for the first time, I felt like he saw me, not just as Mom, but as someone unbreakable. I stood, my resolve hardening. Denise thought she'd rattled me, but all she'd done was show her hand. I walked to the window, the cliffs glowing under the fading sun. Her threat was real, but so was my plan. I'd keep playing their game, letting them think I was weak until the moment was right. Every word, every move was being woven into a net they couldn't escape. What was Denise planning now? And how much closer could I let them get before I turned the tables? The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin, heavy with secrets. I sat at the kitchen table, the notebook open in front of me, its pages filled with my careful records, Denise's threats, Lily's probing, the stranger by the pipes. The security camera's footage was saved on my phone, grainy but clear, capturing Owen's truck lingering near the fence 2 nights ago. The metal box with Eleanor's letter and deed was hidden upstairs now, tucked inside a locked drawer in my bedroom. Each piece was a thread, weaving a net to trap them, but the weight of it all was sinking in. The cliffs outside were shrouded in darkness, the ocean's roar a distant pulse. I traced the rim of my teacup, the porcelain cool against my fingertips, and let my mind wander. For 10 years I'd been the protector, first for my husband, then for Eleanor, always for Max. I'd poured myself into this family, stitching their wounds, carrying their grief, all while mine went unspoken. I'd thought it was strength, that quiet endurance, but now I saw it for what it was, a cage I'd built myself, locked from the inside. I stood, pacing the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under my bare feet. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and salt, the remnants of my earlier cleaning. My eyes drifted to the fridge, where Max's latest drawing, a lopsided sailboat, hung beneath a magnet. He'd drawn it after school, his laughter filling the room as he described the waves he'd imagined. That laughter was why I'd stayed, why I'd endured Denise's barbs and Owen's silence. But it wasn't just Max I was fighting for anymore. It was me, my voice, my worth, the woman I'd buried under years of duty. I thought of Eleanor, her frail hand in mine, her cryptic words, "Keep what belongs to you." I'd thought she meant the house, the deed, but now I wondered if it was more. Maybe she'd seen it, the way I'd dimmed myself, shrinking to fit their expectations. Maybe she'd hidden that deed not just to give me a home, but to give me a reason to fight, to claim what I'd earned. The phone buzzed on the table, snapping me back. It was a text from Mrs. Callahan. Heard Denise was at the diner, talking about clearing out the cliffs. Be careful, Olivia. I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. The diner was Bell Harbor's gossip hub, and Denise knew it. She was planting seeds, turning the town against me, painting me as the stubborn widow squatting in a house I didn't deserve. I saved the text, adding it to my growing file of evidence. Each move she made was a misstep, a crack in her carefully crafted facade. I walked to the sink, splashing cold water on my face, the shock grounding me. My reflection stared back from the window, faint against the night. My eyes were tired but sharp, my mouth set in a line I barely recognized. This wasn't the Olivia who'd stood silent at the funeral, who'd let Denise's orders slide. This was someone new, someone who'd learned to see through their lies, to turn their weapons against them. I thought back to the confrontation with Denise, the way her voice had trembled when I'd pushed back. She'd expected me to crumble, to beg for her approval. Instead, I'd met her fire with my own, and it had shaken her. I could still see the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the moment she realized I wasn't as weak as she'd thought. That moment had changed something in me. For the first time, I hadn't just been protecting Max or Eleanor's legacy. I'd been protecting myself. The realization settled over me, heavy but freeing. All these years I'd been the mother shielding her child, the daughter-in-law caring for Eleanor, the widow honoring a dead man's memory. But who was protecting Olivia? Who was fighting for the woman who'd lost her husband at 25, who'd raised a son alone, who'd given a decade to a family that saw her as nothing? I was, and I always had been, even when I didn't know it. I sat back down, flipping to a new page in the notebook. My pen moved quickly, not to record their actions, but to write something for myself. A promise. I will not let them take what's mine. Not the house, not my son, not my strength. The words were simple, but they anchored me, a vow etched in ink. I closed the notebook, my hand steady, and stood to make another cup of tea. The act was small, ordinary, but it felt like defiance, a refusal to let their schemes consume me. The next morning I woke early, the sky still gray with dawn. Max was still asleep, his door cracked open, his soft snores a quiet comfort. I stood in his doorway, watching the rise and fall of his chest, and felt a surge of clarity. Protecting him meant protecting myself, too. If I let Denise and Owen win, if I let them take this house, it wouldn't just be a loss of property, it would be a betrayal of everything I'd fought to become. I dressed carefully, choosing a sweater Eleanor had given me years ago, its soft blue a reminder of her quiet strength. I slipped the notebook into my bag, along with my phone, its files backed up to a cloud server Mr. Harrington had recommended. I was ready for whatever came next, another visit, another threat, another lie. As I stepped outside, the air was crisp, the cliffs glowing faintly under the rising sun. I walked to the edge of the property, my boots sinking into the damp grass, and looked out at the ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks below, relentless, unyielding. I felt that same strength in me now, a tide that wouldn't be turned back. Denise thought she could break me. Owen thought he could outmaneuver me. Lily thought she could outsmart me. They were wrong. I wasn't just a mother protecting her son, or a widow clinging to a house. I was Olivia Harper, and I was done being invisible. I turned back to the house, my steps firm, my heart steady. The fight was coming, and I was ready. But what shape would their next move take? And how much would I have to reveal to stop them? The rain battered the house, each drop a hammer against the windows, as if the storm outside mirrored the one brewing inside me. I stood in the living room, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the floor. The security camera's app was open on my phone, its feed showing the porch, empty for now, but I checked it every hour. The notebook lay on the coffee table, its pages thick with my records of their moves, Denise's confrontation, Owen's lingering truck, Lily's coffee visits. The metal box with Eleanor's letter and deed was upstairs, locked away, its existence a quiet pulse in my chest. Max was in his room, his laughter muffled as he played a game on his tablet. I'd told him to stay upstairs, my voice calm but firm. The air in the house felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. I'd felt it all day, a prickle on my skin, a certainty that they were coming. Denise's threat in the kitchen, "You'll regret it," wasn't idle. She'd meant it, and I knew her well enough to sense when she was ready to act. I walked to the kitchen, my footsteps soft against the creaking floorboards. The air smelled of rain and the faint tang of the lavender tea I'd brewed earlier, its steam long gone. I poured a fresh cup, the ritual grounding me, and stood by the window watching the cliffs disappear into the storm. The ocean roared below, its waves churning white against the rocks. I felt that same churn in me. Not fear, but resolve, sharp and unyielding. The doorbell rang, cutting through the rain's rhythm. I set the cup down, my movements deliberate, and checked the camera feed. Denise stood on the porch, her umbrella tilted against the wind, Owen beside her, his face half hidden under a cap. Lily was there too, her arms crossed, her eyes darting to the windows. All three of them, together, like a tribunal. My heart thudded, but my hands were steady as I slipped my phone into my pocket, ensuring it was recording. I opened the door, the wind rushing in, carrying the scent of wet earth. "Denise," I said, my voice calm, almost welcoming. "Oh, and Lily, what brings you out in this storm?" Denise stepped forward, her umbrella snapping shut. "We need to settle this, Olivia," she said, her tone clipped. "Now." I gestured to the kitchen, my face neutral. "Come in, let's talk." They filed in, their shoes tracking mud across the floor. I didn't care. The kitchen felt smaller with them in it, their presence heavy, oppressive. Denise sat at the table, her purse placed like a barrier. Owen stood by the counter, his hands in his pockets, his eyes avoiding mine. Lily perched on a stool, her smile tight, her fingers tapping restlessly. I sat across from Denise, my hands folded, my posture relaxed, but my senses razor sharp. "We've been patient," Denise began, her voice low, controlled. "But this has gone on long enough. You need to leave this house, Olivia. The developers are ready to buy, and we're not letting you stand in the way." I tilted my head, letting her words settle. "Stand in the way?" I echoed, my voice soft. "This is my home, Denise. Max's home. Why would I leave?" Owen shifted, his jaw tightening. "It's not yours," he said, his voice gruff, the first time he'd spoken directly to me in weeks. "Mom left it to us. You're just a tenant." Lily nodded, her smile sharp. "Exactly. You've had your time here, Olivia. Be reasonable. Take the money and go." I leaned back, my eyes moving from one to the other, taking in their postures, their tells. Denise's fingers were clenched, Owen's shoulders hunched, Lily's tapping faster now. They were nervous, despite their bravado. They weren't here to negotiate, they were here to demand. "Reasonable," I said, the words slow, deliberate. "You know what's not reasonable? Coming into my home, threatening me, trying to force me out of what's legally mine?" Denise's eyes narrowed, a flash of anger breaking her composure. "Legally yours? Don't be ridiculous. You have nothing, no claim, no proof. You're delusional if you think you can fight us." I smiled, just enough to unsettle her. "Eleanor was more careful than you give her credit for," I said, my voice steady, each word a stone dropped into still water. "She saw you, all of you, for what you are, and she made sure I'd be protected." Owen's head snapped up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. "What are you talking about?" I didn't answer, letting the silence stretch, heavy and thick. Lily's tapping stopped, her smile gone. Denise leaned forward, her voice low, venomous. "If you're implying some secret deal, Olivia, you'd better have proof, because I'll drag you through every court in this state if you try to steal what's ours." The word steal, again, sharp as a blade. I stood, my movement slow, and walked to the counter, turning my back just long enough to let them think I was rattled. My phone was still recording, capturing every word, every threat. I turned, leaning against the counter, my arms crossed. "I'm not stealing anything," I said, my voice calm but edged with steel. "Eleanor gave me this house, legally documented years ago. I have the deed, Denise, and I have her words in her own hand, explaining why she did it. You can fight me, but you'll lose." The room went still, the rain's patter the only sound. Denise's face paled, her mouth opening but no words coming. Owen's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. Lily's eyes darted to Denise, then back to me, her composure cracking. "You're lying," Denise whispered, but her voice wavered, betraying her doubt. "Am I?" I said, stepping closer, my gaze locked on hers. "Go ahead, take me to court. Call your lawyers, your developers, but know this, I'm not the one who'll look like a fool when the truth comes out. You've underestimated me, Denise. All of you have." Owen took a step forward, his voice low, almost a growl. "You don't scare us, Olivia. You're alone. You've got nothing." I smiled, unflinching. "I have everything I need. And you've got greed and lies. Good luck with that." Denise stood, her chair scraping, her face a mask of fury. "This isn't over," she hissed, grabbing her purse. "You'll wish you'd walked away." I held her gaze, my voice steady. Get out of my house." They left, the door slamming behind them, the wind howling in their wake. I stood still, my heart pounding, the adrenaline surging through me. The kitchen felt alive now, the walls echoing my words. I pulled the phone from my pocket, stopping the recording. Their voices were there. Denise's threats, Owen's aggression, Lily's silence, all of it captured, another weapon in my arsenal. I sank into a chair, my hands trembling not with fear, but with power. For the first time, I'd faced them head on, and they'd blinked. I'd seen it. The doubt in Denise's eyes, the crack in Owen's bravado. They weren't invincible. They were scared. I walked to the window, the storm raging outside, the cliffs barely visible through the rain. This house, this life, was mine, and I'd fight for it with everything I had. Their threats had no place here. Not in my world, not anymore. But what would they do now, cornered and desperate? And how far would I have to go to end this once and for all? The dawn broke over Bell Harbor with a soft, golden glow, the cliffs catching the light like they were holding their breath. I stood on the porch, a mug of coffee warming my hands, the steam curling against my face. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clean, but the calm felt deceptive, like the pause before a wave crashes. Inside, the house was still. Max was at school, his backpack slung over his shoulder as he'd waved goodbye, oblivious to the battle I was fighting. The notebook, the recordings, the deed, they were my weapons, locked away but ready. I'd shaken Denise, Owen, and Lily in the kitchen confrontation. I'd seen it in their eyes, doubt, fear, the realization that I wasn't the pushover they'd assumed. But I knew them too well to think they'd back down. They'd regroup, strategize, come at me with something sharper. I sipped my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me, and scanned the street. The security camera's app was open on my phone, its feed clear and steady. No visitors yet, but I was ready. The phone buzzed in my hand, a message from Mr. Harrington. Title transfer is finalized. Deed is officially in your name. Preparing defense for any challenges. Stay vigilant. I exhaled, a weight lifting but not fully gone. The house was legally mine, but legal didn't mean safe, not with Denise's threats echoing in my mind. You'll wish you'd walked away. I saved the message, adding it to my digital vault, and slipped the phone into my pocket. I walked back inside, the floorboards creaking softly, the air carrying the faint scent of lavender from the tea I'd brewed last night. The notebook lay on the kitchen table, its pages a map of their betrayal. I flipped it open, rereading my notes. Denise's diner gossip, Owen's inspector, Lily's probing questions. Each entry was a brick in the wall I'd built, but I needed more. I needed to know their next move, to anticipate it before they struck. I sat, my pen tapping the page, and thought of Eleanor. Her letter had been clear. They'll try to take it, Olivia, but don't let them. She'd known her children's greed, their willingness to erase me to get what they wanted. I traced her words in my mind, her shaky handwriting a lifeline. She'd trusted me to fight, not just for the house, but for the truth, her truth, my truth, the one they thought they could bury. A memory surfaced, sharp and vivid. 2 years ago, Eleanor had sat in this kitchen, her hands trembling as she sipped her tea. She'd been upset, her eyes distant, and I'd asked what was wrong. They're fighting over money that's not even theirs yet, she'd said, her voice bitter. Denise thinks she can control everything. Owen just follows. And Lily, she's worse, whispering in their ears. I'd comforted her, thinking it was just family tension, but now I saw it. She'd been planning the deed then, hiding it to protect me from their claws. I stood, pacing the kitchen, the memory fueling my resolve. Eleanor had seen through them, and now I did too, but seeing wasn't enough. I had to act. I grabbed my phone and called Mrs. Callahan, my voice steady. Hey, it's Olivia. You mentioned Denise at the diner. Did she say anything else? Mrs. Callahan's voice was warm but cautious. She was loud, Olivia. Said you're holding up a big deal, that you're unstable. Claimed you're making things up about Mom's wishes. A few folks believed her, but not everyone. I shut it down, told them you were family to Eleanor? My jaw tightened, but I nodded. Thanks for telling me, and for having my back. Always, she said. Watch yourself, though. She's stirring up trouble. I hung up, my mind racing. Denise was escalating, turning the town against me, laying the groundwork to challenge the deed. I opened my notebook, adding her diner gossip to the list, underlining unstable twice. It was a calculated move, designed to discredit me before I could fight back, but she didn't know about the recordings, the letter, the deed already in my name. She was building a case on lies, and I'd let her, until the moment was right to tear it down. I walked to the living room, my eyes drifting to the dollhouse on the coffee table. Its tiny windows glinted in the morning light, a reminder of Eleanor's cleverness. I knelt beside it, my fingers brushing the miniature porch where I'd found the hidden panel. You knew they'd try this, I whispered, as if she could hear me. You gave me everything I need. The doorbell rang sharp and sudden. I stood checking the camera feed. It was Tom, Owen's friend from the hardware store, his baseball cap pulled low, a clipboard in hand. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. He was the pipe inspector Max had seen, I was sure of it. I slipped my phone into record mode and opened the door, my face a mask of polite curiosity. Morning, Tom said, his voice gruff. Here to check the property line. Owen sent me. I tilted my head, smiling faintly. Property line? That's funny. I wasn't told about any checks. Maybe you should call Owen and clarify. His eyes flickered, caught off guard. It's routine, he muttered, glancing at his clipboard. Won't take long. No, I said, my voice firm but calm. You're not stepping foot on my property without proper notice. Tell Owen to contact my lawyer. Tom hesitated, his jaw tightening, then nodded and left, his truck kicking up gravel as he drove off. I stopped the recording, my hands steady, and added the encounter to my notebook. Owen was getting bolder, sending proxies to test me, but each move gave me more to use against him. That afternoon, I met with Mr. Harrington at his office, the air smelling of leather and ink. I handed him the latest recordings. Denise's threat, her diner gossip, Tom's visit. He listened, his face unreadable, then leaned back. They're building a narrative, he said, painting you as unfit to pressure you into leaving. But these recordings, combined with the deed and Eleanor's letter, are strong. If they challenge you, we'll counter with this, and we'll win. I nodded, my resolve hardening. I want to be ready. Whatever they try next, I want to stop them. He smiled, a rare glint of approval in his eyes. You already are, Olivia. Keep doing what you're doing. Document everything. They're digging their own grave. I left his office, the sun high now, the town bustling with its usual rhythm. I passed the diner, catching a glimpse of Denise's car parked outside. She was still spreading her lies, but I didn't flinch. I walked home, my steps firm, the cliffs glowing in the distance. The truth was mine, and it was rising, unstoppable like the tide. They could scheme, threaten, lie, but the truth couldn't be buried. Not anymore. What desperate move would they make next, and how close could I come to exposing them without tipping my hand? The truth was out, clawing its way to the surface, and their lies were crumbling. Denise's venom, Owen's schemes, Lily's whispers, they'd built a house of cards and I held the match. Could I burn it down without scorching myself? I stayed silent, not out of hesitation, but because I was ready to end their game. The kitchen glowed under the soft light of a single chandelier, its crystals catching the flicker of candles I'd placed on the table. The air was thick with the scent of rosemary and roasted lamb, a meal I'd spent hours preparing, not out of warmth, but strategy. The table was set for 4, the plates gleaming, the wine glasses polished to a shine. Outside, the cliffs stood sentinel, their edges sharp against the twilight sky, the ocean's murmur a steady pulse. Tonight, I wasn't just hosting dinner, I was setting a stage. Max was at Mrs. Callahan's, safe and oblivious, his laughter echoing in my mind as I'd kissed him goodbye. The notebook, the recordings, the deed, they were locked away, but their weight was with me, a quiet strength in my bones. Mr. Harrington had everything he needed. The audio of Denise's threats, the footage of Owen's truck, Tom's fake inspections, Eleanor's letter. The title was mine, the truth undeniable. But I wasn't waiting for their next move. Tonight I'd force their hand. The doorbell rang, sharp and expectant. I smoothed my dress, a deep green, one of Eleanor's favorites, and opened the door. Denise stood there, her lips pursed, her eyes scanning me like I was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Owen was behind her, his cap gone, his face drawn. Lily lingered at the back, her smile tight, her hands fidgeting with her scarf. "Olivia," Denise said, her voice clipped but curious. "This is unexpected." I smiled, warm but calculated. "I thought it was time we talked, really talked. Come in." They hesitated, exchanging glances, but followed me to the kitchen. The table was a masterpiece. Linen napkins, a centerpiece of wildflowers, the lamb perfectly carved. I gestured to their seats, pouring wine with steady hands. "Sit," I said, my voice soft but firm. "Let's share a meal, like family." The word family hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Denise sat, her posture rigid, while Owen slouched, his eyes on the food. Lily perched on the edge of her chair, her fingers tapping the stem of her glass. I took my seat, my hands folded, my face serene but my senses alive. The phone in my pocket was recording, the camera on the shelf discreetly capturing every moment. "This is lovely," Lily said, her voice too bright, breaking the silence. "But what's the occasion?" I tilted my head, my smile unwavering. "Closure," I said simply. "It's been a hard few months. I thought we should clear the air." Denise's eyes narrowed, but she sipped her wine, her movements controlled. "Clear the air? That's generous, considering how difficult you've been." I leaned forward, my voice calm, almost gentle. "Difficult? I've just been protecting what's mine. You'd do the same, wouldn't you?" Owen shifted, his fork clinking against his plate. "What's that supposed to mean?" I took a slow sip of wine, letting the tension build. "It means I know what you've been doing," I said, my tone even, each word a stone dropped into still water. "The developers, the inspectors, the gossip at the diner. You thought you could push me out, make me disappear, but you forgot something." Lily's tapping stopped, her smile gone. Denise leaned back, her face a mask of barely contained fury. "And what's that?" she asked, her voice low, venomous. I met her gaze, unflinching. "Eleanor," I said. "She saw through you, all of you. She knew you'd try to take this house to erase me, so she made sure I'd have what I needed to stop you." Owen's jaw tightened, his hands clenching. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice wavered, betraying his doubt. I smiled, just enough to unsettle them. "Am I?" "I have her deed, Owen, signed, notarized, filed years ago. This house is mine, legally and forever. I have her letter explaining why she did it, because I was her family when you weren't. And I have recordings, your threats, your schemes, your lies, all of it documented, ready for a judge." The room went still, the candles flickering, casting shadows across their faces. Denise's wineglass froze halfway to her lips, her eyes wide with shock. Lily's face paled, her hands trembling. Owen's fists unclenched, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. "You're lying," Denise whispered, but it was weak, a reflex. I stood, my movements slow, deliberate, and walked to the counter, pulling a single page from a folder, the deed, a copy I'd printed for this moment. I slid it across the table, letting it land in front of her. "Read it," I said, my voice steady. "Then tell me I'm lying." Denise's hands shook as she picked it up, her eyes scanning the text. Owen leaned over, his breath ragged, while Lily stared at the table, her composure shattered. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint crackle of the candles. This can't be real," Denise stammered, her voice breaking. "She wouldn't do this." "She did," I said, stepping closer, my voice low but firm. "She chose me because I chose her, every day, for 10 years. Where were you, Denise? Where were any of you?" Lily's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "You manipulated her," she hissed. "You wormed your way in, took advantage." "Enough," I cut in, my voice sharp, slicing through her accusation. You don't get to rewrite history. I was here, Lily. I held her hand, cooked her meals, listened to her stories. You showed up for her money, nothing else. Owen's face crumpled, a flicker of shame crossing his eyes. Denise's hands clenched the deed, crumpling its edges, but she didn't speak. The fight was gone, replaced by a dawning realization they'd lost. I sat back down, my hands folded, my voice calm again. You can challenge the deed, I said. Take me to court, drag this out, but you'll lose, and everyone in Bell Harbor will know what you tried to do. Or you can walk away now, leave me and Max in peace, and salvage what's left of your pride. The candles burned lower, the wax pooling on the table. Denise's eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw fear, raw, unguarded. She stood, her chair scraping, and grabbed her purse. This isn't over, she said, but her voice was hollow, a shadow of its former venom. It is, I said, my tone final. Leave my house. They left without another word, the door closing softly behind them, the rain a faint patter now. I stood in the kitchen, the untouched meal cooling, the wine glasses half full. The silence was different now, not heavy, but free, like the air after a storm. I stopped the recording, saved the footage, and sent it all to Mr. Harrington. Every word, every reaction was captured, sealing their defeat. I walked to the window, the cliffs glowing faintly under the rising moon. The house was mine, Max was safe, and I was whole. Their greed had been their downfall, and I'd turned their feast into their reckoning. But would they truly walk away? Or would one last spark of desperation ignite something I hadn't foreseen? The morning sun spilled across the cliffs, painting the grass in shades of gold and green. I stood on the porch, a shawl draped over my shoulders, the air cool and sharp with the scent of salt and pine. The house behind me creaked softly, its weathered walls a testament to everything I'd fought for. The deed was mine, the recording safely with Mr. Harrington, and Denise, Owen, and Lily were gone, silenced by their own shame, their threats reduced to echoes. But as I sipped my coffee, the steam curling against my face, I felt no triumph, only a quiet, aching clarity. Max's laughter broke the stillness, drifting from the backyard where he kicked a soccer ball against the fence. "Mom, come play!" he called, his voice bright, untouched by the battle I'd waged. I smiled, setting my mug on the railing, and walked to join him. His curls bounced as he ran, his sneakers scuffing the dirt. I kicked the ball back, my movements slow but deliberate, and for a moment, the world was simple, just me, my son, and this patch of earth we called home. But my mind wandered, replaying the dinner, their faces when I'd laid the deed on the table. Denise's fury, Owen's defeat, Lily's silence. They'd left without a fight, their bravado shattered. Mr. Harrington had called yesterday, confirming the developers had backed off, spooked by the legal mess Denise's lies had created. The town was buzzing, Mrs. Callahan told me, with whispers of their greed, their betrayal of Eleanor's memory. I'd won, but the victory felt hollow, like a prize I hadn't sought. I sat on the grass, Max flopping beside me, his breath quick from running. "Mom," he said, picking at a blade of grass, "are we staying here forever?" The question caught me, soft but heavy. I looked at him, his wide eyes searching mine, and felt a pang of gratitude for his innocence. "As long as we want to," I said, brushing a curl from his forehead. "This is our home." He nodded, satisfied, and ran off to chase the ball again. I leaned back, the grass cool against my palms, and let my gaze drift to the cliffs. The ocean stretched beyond, its waves a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. This house, this land, was mine. Not just because of the deed, but because of what it held. Max's laughter, Eleanor's trust, the years I'd poured into making it a home. But as I sat there, I realized I didn't need to cling to it out of fear. I'd fought to keep it, but now I could choose what to keep. Not just a house, but a life. I walked inside, the air smelling of coffee and the faint lavender of Eleanor's old sachets. The dollhouse sat on the living room table, its tiny windows catching the light. I knelt beside it, my fingers tracing the miniature porch where I'd found the deed. "Thank you," I whispered, not to the house, But to Eleanor, whose strength had carried me here, she'd given me more than a home. She'd given me the courage to see my own worth. I opened the notebook, its pages worn from weeks of writing. I didn't add to it this time. Instead, I flipped to a blank page and wrote something new. What I keep: Max's smile, my strength, our peace. The words were simple, but they felt like a vow, a line drawn between the past and what came next. I closed the book, my hands steady, and tucked it into a drawer. I didn't need to document their lies anymore. I was done looking back. That afternoon, I visited Mrs. Callahan at the bakery, the bell jingling as I stepped inside. The air was warm, thick with the scent of fresh bread and cinnamon. She smiled, sliding a loaf across the counter. "You're the talk of the town, Olivia," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Folks are saying you're a force to be reckoned with." I laughed, the sound lighter than I'd expected. "I just did what I had to," I said, taking the bread. "For Max. For me." She nodded, her smile softening. "Eleanor would be proud. You honored her in every way." The words settled over me, warm and grounding. I left the bakery, the loaf tucked under my arm, and walked home, the cobblestones gleaming under the sun. The town felt different now, not a place of whispers and judgment, but a community I could choose to be part of. I waved at Mr. Porter, who tipped his hat, his usual gossip replaced with a quiet respect. Back at the house, I started dinner, chopping vegetables with a rhythm that felt like healing. Max ran in, his hands muddy, his grin wide. "Can we have pie for dessert?" he asked, hopping onto a stool. "Only if you help," I said, tossing him an apple. He laughed, peeling it with exaggerated care, and I felt a swell of love so fierce it nearly stopped my heart. This was what I chose to keep, not the anger, not the fight, but these moments, small and perfect. That night, I sat on the porch, the stars bright above the cliffs. The ocean whispered below, its voice a lullaby. I thought of Denise, Owen, Lily. Wherever they were no longer my burden. I'd let go of their betrayal, their greed, keeping only the lessons they'd taught me, to stand, to fight, to choose myself. The house creaked behind me, a familiar sound, like a friend settling in for the night. I smiled, wrapping my shawl tighter, and let the peace wash over me. I'd fought for this life, and now I could live it, fully, freely on my terms. But what would I build on this foundation? And what new dreams would I dare to chase?